18 years ago, my life changed quickly. I wasn't ready, but I learned. Today, we talk about living through Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Hi, my name is Rob Hunter. This is Equal Matters, the intro, produced and played by Cal the Guitar Hero. You can catch him a couple episodes back here on Equal Matters. Today, I want to go back 18 years. I was sitting in a radio studio in New Orleans, Louisiana, looking out one of our big windows. To my right was my radio show co-host at the time on the Rob Hunter Morning Show, Shane. Shane was doing the same thing, looking out the window. We had our feet up against the window, sitting in one of those high office chairs. We were looking at Hurricane Katrina as it was dumping rain all across New Orleans. By then, we were knocked off the air, and all we could do was look. And it's funny to look back at those moments, staring out that window, watching things blow across the street, bits of roofs falling off because of Hurricane Katrina, water everywhere. One of the things I most remember is looking out the window and seeing the street signs sway in those gusts. The wind was so strong, it just made those signs just look like they were Gumby. Fascinating to watch. And the water was just everywhere. This is what you sign up for as a broadcaster. You don't leave when hurricanes come. You do what you do. You get behind your microphone, press the on button, and you aim to inform as best you can. Get them the information as accurately and quickly as possible. And in that moment of doing that job, I didn't stop and consider that my life could forever change in this moment because I was in the moment. I had a job to do. I wasn't scared. I showed up to work, ready for whatever came. But there's some important lessons in going back through Hurricane Katrina that apply to not just my life, but any life. Because life is super interesting is that we get to live it as individuals, but because we are humans, we all have different experiences, but a lot of the same rules apply. So at the age of 27, in a city that I loved, New Orleans, looking out at that storm as it crushed the city, we weren't even sure what to do. A couple of days before that, we had showed up at work ready to do that job, and that's what we did. But when the station was knocked off the air and we couldn't broadcast anymore, all we could do was sit. And it was odd, too, as day stretched into night, how quiet it was in New Orleans. New Orleans is not known for its silence. Loud party city, people out all hours of the night, parties going all hours of the night. But there was not a sound. Not a sight, because it was pitch black. There was no power. It was strange to be in that environment in a radio studio filled with all the latest technology and broadcast equipment, but not being able to really use it. Not being able to be connected. Because the news continued after Hurricane Katrina knocked us off the air, but we didn't have access to it. We were silent. So if you paid attention, watched Katrina unfold on television or heard it on the radio, there was probably a point where you had more information than I did. Because you're sitting there in the dark in the radio station trying to figure out what to do. So the storm came on a Monday morning officially. It knocked us off the air Monday morning around 9:15. So Monday we just kind of hung around. People took naps because we had been broadcasting for 36 hours straight without sleeping much. Some of us ate. And then we weren't really sure how long we were going to be at the radio station. So we're trying to plan that out because we had one of those water fountains, the big plastic jugs you tip over and you put in the little faucet. And it was hot because it's August in New Orleans. So I live in Phoenix now. We have a dry heat. New Orleans has a very wet heat. It's humid. So we're getting hot, drinking water. But starting to think about, well, maybe we should start not necessarily rationing the water, but making sure we only drink it when we're thirsty in case we have to stay for a few days. Because there didn't seem to be an apparent way out. So Monday, we play some games. We have a good time, get some sleep, get up on Tuesday morning. We're trying to figure out what to do. And we eventually realize that no one is coming to save us. And this is important life lesson number one. When emergencies happen, you have to be prepared. And you have to be prepared ahead of time. Because there's certain lessons in and around Katrina about preparedness that I still take with me to this day. Because if I can back you up to the Saturday before Katrina hit, we knew it was coming our way. So living in the city of New Orleans, we had a pretty good lineup on our talk station. I, at the time, was the morning show host. I had been brought in to do an afternoon show. My new hours were 6 to 9, and we were doing really well. We had doubled the ratings in 6 months. So we're very proud of the work that we were doing. And then we had a show called The Neil Bort Show, nationally syndicated out of Atlanta. And this was the reason I really fell in love with the concept of talk radio, because the first station I worked with in Gainesville, Florida, aired Neil Bort's show. And I would listen to his show, and I'm like, I can do that. And here it was, the weekend of Katrina. Neil Bort, that talk show host, was coming into New Orleans to do a book signing for our small little radio station. So we had rented a couple of cars because Neil was bringing his radio team. So I think 4 people came with him. So we rented 2 cars because they had to be in 2 different places. One of those cars was an H3, a Hummer. And we wanted to do it right to make sure that Mr. Bortz felt appreciated. Lo and behold, that decision made by my boss to rent that H3 was one of the keys to getting us out of New Orleans after Katrina. So it's weird how sometimes those circumstances happen. One little decision turns out to be a key decision. So as we were leaving on Tuesday night, half the crew packed into the H3. The other half, myself included, went into Shane's truck, an F-150. The H3 and the F-150 were just high enough above the waterline where we could get in them, we could start the cars, and we could head out. We went west, first towards Baton Rouge, where we stopped to eat, still in a daze about what we had just experienced, then on to Houston. And it was on that drive, most of which was done in silence, it's about 5 or 6 hours from New Orleans to Houston, that it dawns on you that your life's changing, that you don't know what you're going back to. All of us left right from the radio station. We didn't get to check our homes or our apartments. We just left, figuring we'd figure it out later. And it's in that moment when you're driving on I-10 in silence, not sure what to say, when you do realize that in times like this, you're kind of on your own. And I'm not saying that to be a bad thing. I'm saying that to offer you hope, to be prepared. And to the second lesson, be adaptable. Because this is really the key to all of it. So we had warning that Hurricane Katrina was coming when Neil Bortz was in town, and we got him to the airport, and we went right back around and went to work. Because we had to be adaptable. Because this storm was adaptable. If I remember correctly, and I didn't look this up, I probably should have, Hurricane Katrina first went across Florida. And it was supposed to tilt back towards Florida. But it didn't. Instead, it started coming right for New Orleans. Aimed directly at us. And I'd only been living in New Orleans for 2 years at that point, but almost as soon as I'd gotten there in 2003, I started doing some research and started learning about hurricanes and the potential damage. Another interesting coincidence. And I'd have friends tell me that the last time a hurricane came, they evacuated. They weren't sure if they would do it again because the last time was a dud. Well, this one wasn't a dud, and thankfully everybody knew it. And I think we didn't really get word that Katrina was bearing down on New Orleans until Friday night. So it essentially gave an entire city and its suburbs 48 hours to get out of Dodge because the storm was expected to start raining and having powerful winds on Sunday night. By and large, that went pretty well. But our job is to stay behind with the people that stayed behind because not everybody can leave. You may remember the images, people in the Superdome, people in the New Orleans Convention Center. I heard some stories. We ended up in a hotel in Houston, met an older couple who described what it was like being in the Superdome because that's where they were. They said it was awful. There was no one there to help. It was all, you're on your own. So to reinforce that lesson, not in a bad way, just in a real way, that when it's time, it's up to you. So our adaptability was to be able to get into that H3 and the F-150 and get out of town. Because we knew at that point we couldn't broadcast. There was no way we'd ever find out, sitting in that radio station without power, without phone lines, when and if it would ever return. Because the radio station has all kinds of equipment that transmit the signal, including a transmitter. That was right where the bad part of Hurricane Katrina hit. So I think it was at 9:15 in the morning. All of a sudden, everything just stopped. Our job was over. So that adaptability that led us to that moment to be able to make sure that we broadcast as much information as possible came in handy when it came to getting out of town. But it's not just getting out of town that you have to be adaptable with. It's what comes next. So we got to Houston, and we ended up staying at a hotel. And the company was really generous with that. But it was constant adaptation from there on out. Because what happened next is that we all went our separate ways. There's a picture on my Facebook page if you want to go find it. Again, my name is Rob Hunter if you're just joining me. And it shows the team. That was the last picture we took together because we all flew and drove in different directions. Mrs. Hunter and I ended up going to her family's house, her parents' house in Florida, Ocala to be specific, unsure of what was going to happen next. So we went to Ocala, and a couple of people went back to New Orleans. I remember Shane telling me, Katrina hit on his birthday, by the way. And as we were sitting there staring out the windows, I was talking about, I looked over at him. I said, hey, happy birthday. He looked at me and said a profanity. I texted him this week, the 18th anniversary, and I said, happy Katrina Day and birthday. And he said that Katrina was his last memorable birthday. And I'm like, well, thankfully, we're not all that memorable, right? Every birthday. Because ultimately, you can't control what's going to happen. You can only control what you do with what happens. That's that adaptability. So as Mrs. Hunter and I went to Ocala, her company transferred her to Atlanta. So like, all right, we're adapting on the fly. We're trying to figure this out. Meanwhile, our cars are still in New Orleans. Our apartment is still in New Orleans. All of our stuff in our apartment is still in New Orleans. So we're not really sure what to do. So Shane drove back after the hotel stay in Houston and had to stay in his car overnight because they didn't let anybody into the city of New Orleans for a few days. Might have been a week. So meantime, we're trying to contact him about what he's seeing, but it's hard to get a hold of people in New Orleans because cell phones aren't super reliable after the storm. And I don't even remember at this point where everybody else scattered to, but it was all across the place. I think Daniel ended up going home. Crystal, I can't remember where she ended up going to. But it was just a weird moment to know that we're leaving. We might never be together again. Some of them I've seen. Some of them I haven't since then, 18 years ago. Because you have to adapt. It's just unfortunate, but life happens. It doesn't wait for you. It doesn't take notes. It just happens. And I used to look at Hurricane Katrina as, why did it happen to me? But I quickly was able to move past that because I realized I was one of the fortunate ones. And in realizing that I was one of the fortunate ones, it brings up a third life lesson of make the most of it. Enjoy as many moments as you can. Because sometimes you never know when they're going to end. Sometimes it ends in a good way, sometimes not so much. Sometimes it happens because of a hurricane. But I look back at those 2 years that I spent in New Orleans, in the friendships that I made, bonds that we created, and the difference we made, and the success that we had. And thankfully, I somehow was wise enough to be able to take a lot of that in. And really, even though this was a monumental change, I was still able to look back with gratitude about the time that I had in New Orleans. It wasn't as long as I wanted. I thought I'd be there 3, 4, maybe 5 years because I really did love it. I loved the people. I loved the city. I loved the partying. I loved the radio station. I loved the team. It was just an awesome time of life. But because I was able to enjoy those moments, weirdly, I was able to make the most of it. So I take all of those lessons with me all the time to try to remind myself that you can only control you. You can't control what happens. You can't control who the president is. You can't control what decisions courts make or whether hurricanes come towards you or not. All you can do is be prepared and understand that no one's coming to save you, at least not on your timeline. They'll come to save you, but they got to save thousands of other people, and sometimes it takes a while, so they'll show up on their timeline. So be prepared and have a plan. But that adaptability is really what stands out. Because after ending up going from Houston, New Orleans, we'll say, drive to Houston, fly to Florida, hang out on Amy's parents for a few days, drive up to Atlanta, about 7 hours north of where Amy's parents live, and Amy starts going to work. Now, it just so happens that I mentioned Neil Bortz. Neil Bortz from Atlanta. I'm in Atlanta. I reach out to Neil and I say, hey, Neil, I'd love to come see your radio station. Sit on the show. He says, absolutely, come on by. So I gone over to Neil Bortz, and he gives me a lot of credit because I was the guy that drove him to the airport in New Orleans. And for a long time, during Hurricane Katrina anniversary, he would shout me out on the air on his nationally syndicated radio show, of which he let me be a guest on, to say that I no longer had a job. And he helped pitch a job for me. Same goes for Glenn Beck. And if you listen to talk radio, Glenn Beck is extremely talented. He invited me on because the New Orleans station that we were on, WTIX, aired the Glenn Beck show. He pitched me for a job. Adaptability, being able to do those things. But in Atlanta, not only did Neil Bortz let me jump on his radio show, he also introduced me to his boss, a program director by the name of Pete Spriggs. So Neil sits me down in front of Pete. Pete says, just so happens I have a job open. It's a nighttime job at 7 to 10 p.m. I'd love it if you could fill in for 3 days. And I said, this is fantastic. Maybe this is meant to be. Pete even said the same thing. He says, Mayor, it's serendipity. I don't know. He just landed in my lap. Adaptability. But here's another opportunity. So I take it. I do the 3 nights. I do pretty well. I loved it, too. WSB in Atlanta is one of these great legendary radio stations that just dominates the city. It's the news, the traffic station. It's a stud of a radio station. And I thought, man, this would be just epic to be washed out from Hurricane Katrina and end up at one of the best radio stations in the country. But it didn't go my way. I finished in the top 3, and I felt pretty good about that. But I thought, sure, all right, if I'm pretty good and pretty close to getting a job at WSB, I could probably get a job. I mean, I got Hurricane Katrina. I got a story. And it was a story that worked for a little while. I was on a local news station in Boston, Massachusetts, my hometown, and a local survives Hurricane Katrina. That was pretty fun. Wrote an article for Talkers Magazine, did numerous other interviews. But it really led nowhere. Or so I thought. But I stepped being adaptable. So I had a routine after Katrina, living in Atlanta. Mrs. Hunter and I were staying in an extended stay hotel. Ever stayed in one of those? Imagine staying in there for 3 or 4 months. It's basically a room with a small kitchenette. But we adapted. I ended up going to buy an $88 TV so I could play video games. Look, I was unemployed. It was an interesting time, and I just didn't know what to do other than apply for every single job that I find. So I had that routine where I'd get up, Amy would go to work, I would get online, and I would look for jobs. Radio jobs, radio jobs, radio jobs. And I would apply to every new job every single day. Occasionally, I'd hear something. Occasionally, there'd be some interest. A station in Anchorage, Alaska came to mind, did a phone interview. Wasn't the right fit. Nibbles, nibbles, nibbles. Nothing worked out. And then one day, as that routine changed locations from Atlanta back to the Boston area where my family lives, I sent out an email with some audio clips from my old radio shows to a small station in Farmington, New Mexico. Adaptability. So they fly me out. I get the job. I take the job. I take the job, and I'm wondering, man, is this what happened to me? Going back to that question, why'd this happen to me? Because here I am in a small town. And in the radio business, we often dread that move to the small town because you might stay there. You might get stuck. And I was a guy that had big dreams to be a big broadcaster in a big city. And what was I doing here? I was adapting. I couldn't control what happened in life. I couldn't control that Hurricane Katrina showed up in New Orleans, but I could adapt to what life was giving me. And when it gives you things, it gives you lessons. So because I was adaptable, because we realized no one was coming to save us, because I was able to enjoy so many of those moments and look back at them with gratitude, to find myself in the situation in Farmington was still challenging. But it also taught me a bunch of things. Most importantly, the lesson of humility. It's a hard one to learn. When you get your first crack at 23, you get your first show a couple months later, you get your first full-time show at 25 in a top 50 market, as we call them in the business, basically population metrics. Top 50 is where you want to be. So 25 in a top 50. I was living high in the hog, man. I was thinking I was the man. Way ahead of the game here. But I had to get taught a little lesson in humility, which I learned in Farmington, New Mexico. And interestingly enough, in being adaptable, in being willingness is the number one rule of success. I was willing to go to Farmington to do what I love to do. And I do think that if you go with what you feel is right for you, you get tested all the time. It's on purpose. Here's a little test for you. See if you can handle Farmington, New Mexico. Because if you want to be the best, you want to be great, you got to go through the trials and tribulations. I'm not saying that's where I'm at because I'm talking about humility, but I know that the work is required in order to break through. And through Katrina, I learned all these things. And through Katrina, the adaptability is something I apply because it turned out being adaptable, going from New Orleans to Houston to Ocala, Florida to Atlanta, Georgia, to sitting in that radio station, to trying out for the job that I didn't get, it turned out to be a massive key because a consultant heard it because he was helping Pete make that decision, helping him find talent. He was the guy that ran that radio station at WSB. His name is Greg Mosheri. So about 6 months after living in Farmington, New Mexico, I get an email from Greg Mosheri out of the blue, and it says, I want you to send your tapes, CDs, to this guy named Russ Hill in Phoenix, Arizona. So I did. So see what being adaptable did. It didn't open the immediate door to the immediate reward, but months later it did. Now, I tried out to be a talk show host at this station in Phoenix, KTAR, a job I didn't get. Rightfully so, because there were so many more talented, more seasoned broadcast professionals. But I did end up working at that station for the talk show host they hired. A guy named Darryl Ancarlo, who taught me so much about how to be a better radio show host, a better broadcaster, just a better all-around human being. And that's what I realized my journey through radio has been. It has been a collection of lessons, a collection of tools, and a collection of awesome people that have taught me all kinds of great things. So sometimes through adversity, if you open your mind to it, you learn great lessons. You learn about the power of being adaptable because good things happen when you're adaptable. It might not happen tomorrow. It might not happen in a month or 2 months, maybe not even in a year. But eventually it happens. It happens on its own timeline, a timeline that you can't control. A timeline that for me, 18 years ago, ran through the city of New Orleans. 2 of the greatest years in my life. 2 of the most educational years in my life. For some times that I'll never forget. Because I learned so many great lessons, including be prepared, because no one's coming to save you on your timeline. So have a plan right now for worst-case scenarios. The second is adaptability, because the Stoics taught us back in the day that the dichotomy of control is the one thing that's true. You can only control you, not what will happen, only what you will do and what you will say and what you will think about what does happen. So for me, Hurricane Katrina was just that moment in life. I was there, and then I wasn't. but I'm still here, and I still get to talk to you. And I appreciate you being here with us on Equal Matters, because over the course of this career, dating back even past 18 years ago in New Orleans, I've met so many awesome people along the way. So many awesome people that you've heard here on these podcasts. New York Rob, 20-year cop. Justin Cross served on the flight deck of the U.S. Navy. Mark Devine, #1 radio show host. Cal the Guitar Hero. Representative Annalise Ortiz, U.S. Congressman David Schweikert. Dr. Steve and Dr. Keiko and Dr. Sarah. All those people have enriched my life, and I get to share them with you through this podcast. And I get to share these lessons with you and hope that maybe there's something you can pick up in here. Because maybe you just happen to have a difficult challenge in life like I had with Hurricane Katrina. If you can understand that you can get through it, will get through it, you are prepared, you're adaptable, and you can, even in the midst of challenges, try to find moments to enjoy. A little bit here, a little bit there. Because through this whole journey, dating back to New Orleans, I realize how amazing life truly is. Even the bad times. Because they help you arrive at where you're at now. They help you be the person you are now. That is where we're equal. Because we all make decisions. Those decisions shape us. We all believe things. Those belief systems shape us. And ultimately, not only are we all created equal, we all matter. So thanks for letting me share some of my life lessons with you, dating back to 2003 through 2005. My 2 years in New Orleans, cut short, but still an impressionable time for me. Again, my name is Rob Hunter. This is Equal Matters. Good night.